Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're all here, and um, I was kind of excited to do this sort of third installation of sort of this codependency. I'm hoping to do five. Um, so today I'm going to do a brief review of some stuff. So all of the presentations, one kind of flows into the other. And today, what I really want to focus on is the change process related to boundaries, setting appropriate boundaries, what it's like for a person who has a loved one um, who is trying to make some change in their life. Typically, those people in my realm are addicts and alcoholics. And so it can be quite frustrating. So this discussion is about people who are loved ones of the addicts and alcoholics. Um, the next webinar I'll do on June 30th. Most likely that's going to be around a little deeper into communicating and how to actually hold those boundaries and communicate them. Excuse me. But today we're just going to talk about um, setting them and the change process and really how that works, or at least how I view how it works. So everything I say here today is definitely a combination of research plus experience. Um, so uh, please don't take it as the end all be all or the cemented version of how this should work. This is just sort of a compilation of what I've gathered and experienced over the last approximately 15 years. So I've included some of these old slides and not necessarily old, but I include them in this just so you have the references. So the first webinar, we talked a lot about the history and sort of the development of how attachment and codependency sort of appeared in the research literature. So if you want to look up some of these books, these are certainly not all of them, but these are some of the landmark books. And at the end of the second one last month that is, I sort of introduced this idea of co-recovery. And really how I view this is the recovery process is a co-recovery experience for everyone. So, and I've said this a few times, it's probably harder for me to convince or encourage or support a person who has a loved one who's an alcoholic and addict to go to Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous or one of those groups than it is actually to convince an addict or an alcoholic to get to one of those groups of AA or NA. And part of that is that they don't see that there's a part in this. And so I really look at this as this idea of co-recovery, because if one party tries to change and the other one tries to stay the same, you're going to run into problems. So I really believe everybody needs to work on themselves separately so that they can come together with a higher level of understanding and awareness about themselves and how they react slash respond to situations. So to keep this in mind, this was also last month, just the idea that for anyone to grow and change, there needs to be a balance of challenge and support. So too much challenge is not good enough. Too much support is not good enough. They have to be balanced for the person to actually feel comfortable in that change process. So, and the reason I bring that up is that people have feelings, we have emotional responses all the time. And so knowing and being aware of what your responses are can tell you whether something you're about to do or are doing is feeling right or good. So I try to give an example. When there's balanced challenge and support, a person feels an increased self-efficacy, they have an increased self-esteem, etc. They have courage to act within their own moral compass. And that's really kind of what this is all about, because with addicts and alcoholics and people who are tending to codependent traits, people on both sides of that equation can be um, encouraged or influenced to do something that goes against their moral compass. For example, addicts are notorious for becoming someone who might thieve to support their habit, or lie, or do something else that is really not something that they were brought up or that they believe is right and good to do. And the same thing happens with codependents, where they will help too much. They'll give people money when they don't feel they deserve it. So it's really important to keep an eye on how you're feeling as these relationships are developing and as you're developing. Um, some of the feelings when things aren't balanced. If you're feeling defensive, frustrated, or like you're losing interest or you want to give up, that's a sign that something obviously is not working. So people need to pay attention to those feelings when they appear, and honor them as far as uh, um, naming them, describing them, and working through them. So when those feelings of defensiveness and or frustration or some other negative type of feeling is coming up, it's important to really pay attention to that, because it's telling you that your challenge and support is unbalanced. Um, so I've included these slides in here. This was just kind of a list of my gathered list of supporting behaviors and enabling behaviors or thought patterns. So we kind of went over these last time, but you can go through this PowerPoint later when Megan sends it to you, and you can explore them a little deeper. Again, these are things that I've collected over time. So some of the things that always stick out for me on this is the overprotecting due to fear and guilt, um, and focusing on problems instead of solutions and strengths. Here's another continuation of that list. And for purposes of this one, probably one of the main enabling behaviors is communication, or excuse me, making choices without consideration for yourself. A lot of times, people, it's always important for us to put ourselves out for our loved ones, and sometimes we do things that we don't really want to do, but it's not really harming us in small doses. But over time, those choices to continue to put yourself out when you don't really need to, that tends to build up, and it has an influence on your self-care, your self-view, your emotional balance, etc. So a lot of times, people with a tendency to this codependent trait pattern, um, they tend to continue to make choices that they know are against their own best interest. And then that builds up resentment and anger, frustration, and all those types of things. Also, probably one of the hardest things, I'm going to use my pointer here because I didn't put this all up in the slideshow because I like to be able to point at things, and I can't do that in the slideshow. But this being willing to say no, that's a pretty big deal, and we'll kind of probably delve into that a little more. Knowing when to say no and being willing to say no and being able to say no are probably three different things. So in setting these boundaries, it's really important to be able to, when you define a boundary, to make sure that it's something that you can hold to, which means that the change has to happen very slowly. So here's just kind of a list of enabling behaviors that people avoid conflict, they deny the seriousness of the problem, they criticize, blame, judge. Rescuing is a big part of this codependent process, especially when the person doesn't really need rescuing, and actions that make it easier for the person to continue self-destructive behavior. So some of these supportive behaviors, and these are all from the previous slideshow, so you can look those up again too. But this is what we're really trying to do, is be honest, authentic, respectful, trusting, loyal, non-judgmental as best as we can, accepting of the situation, And I took this phrase from Al-Anon and the Love First book by John and Deborah Jay, that having a sense of loving detachment. I can love you and not be attached to your situation at the same time, which kind of goes back to the prior two presentations about attachment and how am I attached to things. So we're trying to create some healthy boundaries and create a differentiation from the person in the relationship. So typically these relationships are somehow enmeshed, and there's a codependent and dependent cycle that has been most likely going on for quite a few years. Um, so I'm going to kind of briefly touch on this because I believe it's really important when people are working on making a change like this. Um, Remember that we're trying to change something that has been years and most likely decades in the making. So, and you can look up this article. This is a really was a really influential article for me. It's by White and Kurtz, and I believe William White is the one that wrote a book called "Slaying the Dragon," which was a history of all of the treatment, sort of the progress of treatment in the United States, way back from colonial times and the Washingtonians up to the present time. So I really respect him. But what he said about change is that um, incremental change, there's a couple of ways that change can happen. It can happen incrementally, and it can happen with what he called quantum change. I call epiphanal or epiphanic change. And so we all know what that's like. And when we have an epiphany, on occasion, we'll have this light bulb go on and we'll be able to make a change right away, um, without a lot of work because it's so apparent to us. But those are actually fairly rare and far and few between. The most lasting change happens very incrementally with intent and purpose. Um, so I will probably return to that as we go. So this is the stages of change process. So I also had this in my last month's PowerPoint. Um, the reason I bring this up is that for me, the change process has three sort of tasks that need to be completed. And for me, a person needs to be aware of their reactions and the changes that they need to make in order to evolve the relationship, um, that they have with themselves first and their loved ones second. And that's in reverse order from what people will usually say. I need to fix my loved one before I fix myself. And that's actually backwards. So increasing awareness doesn't sound like a lot, but it's really the first step in being able to make any sort of change. And then I have to be willing to put myself in the same change process as I want my loved one to aspire to and master. So I really like to practice what I preach, so I don't tell anybody to do an exercise or a process that I haven't done myself if I'm not willing to do it. And I actually have to be willing to do something different than I've been doing. And once I decide, and this is really where the work is, because they say in AA and NA, I've got to be willing to go to any length, right? But I think this is really where the work is in recovery. And it's not just being willing to go to any length, it's being willing to do something differently than the survival mechanism that I've used prior in my life for quite a long period of time. Just like an addict or alcoholic has to change their coping mechanism of drinking or using, a codependent has to change their coping mechanism of controlling or rescuing or problem solving for another person. Little harder than it sounds. And then, of course, the last thing is self-intervention. And so for me, uh, I always kind of make a joke with my clients. I tell them my job is to work myself out of a job with you. And, uh, and I do that by teaching them how to self-intervene. And that's really um, the very baseline process of how a counseling or a therapeutic relationship works. The person learns how to self-intervene, they work on those things, and then they learn how to do it themselves. And eventually they don't need the outside encouragement and help from a therapist or a counselor. So to me, three steps: awareness of feelings, reactions, constructions, and beliefs. And so what I mean about constructions are, those are like the stories that I tell myself about a situation. So because I'm weird, I'm gonna just fix a typo that I noticed because I can't help myself. Um, Constructions, there's a theory called construct theory, and it's really about what constructions am I making about a situation. And so I have to be sort of aware of the stories that I tell myself, because those stories turn into beliefs, and those beliefs turn into feelings and actions. Willingness to try differently but not harder. So people a lot of times will say, I just need to try harder, I need to, I need to just buckle down and do better. And I tell them, no, it's not trying harder, it's trying differently. So which actually is harder than just trying harder, because trying to do something different is uncomfortable and can be off-putting, or uh, a person doesn't really have experience that they can succeed, so their confidence can go down. So trying something differently, I got to be willing to do something different than I've tried in the past. And then number three, of course, is attempt a new strategy. So what we need to do is, here's the same stages of change, and I've just put in here in these 6 stages typical things, and you can put whatever you want in here that you're struggling with. For codependent and attachment stuff, I put in enabling, boundaries, self-care, and trauma responses. Those are typically the things that people that struggle with addicts have to work around in order to evolve the relationship they have with themselves. And so as I go around this, I'm just gonna go down to the next slide, because I write this out flat, um, but it's actually sort of a circular motion. So the pre-contemplation is I don't believe I have a problem. Contemplation is I might have a problem with whatever it is. Preparation is I need to plan, and some people call this determination or planning. So preparation, planning, determination, all is sort of the same stage. But I need to prepare, I need to take action, which just means doing it, which is kind of step 3 of that process I showed you before, which is the self-intervention. And I need to do that for a long period of time, and I end up into a place of maintenance. And hopefully, after a long period of time, those behaviors become internalized, and I can exit this model. Uh, some people don't put relapse as a stage of change. I put relapse as a stage of change because I can't think of anything I've ever tried to do where I got it the first time and I didn't have a relapse. So for me, relapse is part of the process, and it's not that relapsing is being condoned. I have to change my view of what a relapse is and determine that that relapse is actually information for me to improve myself. And so the big question is what do I do after a relapse? Because you can see there's no arrow to pre-contemplation. Um, the idea here is that if I relapse, I will ask people, and since I can't do it as a group in here, I will ask people, what do I do after a relapse? And they'll say, well, I got a pre-contemplation and I got to go back around the circle. And that's not actually true. And some people will say, well, if you relapse, you have to do what I was told as a kid, to just get up and try again, and you keep trying and pushing forward. And so you go into the action phase. And this is what drives most people crazy about addicts and other people that don't or aren't able to sustain a change. They end up going back and forth. They relapse, they go into action. Well, I'll try it again, and I'll just, as far as drinking is concerned, or using substances, I'll just stop again tomorrow and I'll try again. And then a couple days later, they relapse, and they end up doing this sort of ping pong match between relapse and action. And nothing ever really happens. And the same thing happens with codependence. They will try not to enable, and then they'll end up enabling, and they'll go, oh, well, I'll try not to do that next time. And they end up ping ponging back and forth. And so this is actually the reason that New Year's resolutions don't work. And the the reason they don't work is that it's not uh, feasible or advisable to just go back and forth into action and then relapse. I have to go into preparation. I have to return to preparation. I don't have to pre-contemplate or re-contemplate that situation again, because I already know I have a problem with X, right? X, Y, or Z. I have these problems. I don't have to re-contemplate those things. But there is something in the preparation process that I missed. So I have to ask myself, what did I miss? What can I do differently? What wasn't I prepared for? How can I improve, etc. And so I re-prepare, and then I enter back into action. And this ends up going around and around, sometimes quite a while for people. And I put the little spiral next to this because when people are looking at this flat, they think it's just this cyclical thing, but it's not. You actually, the next time I go to preparation, I actually don't have to prepare for the things I prepared for last time. I have to prepare for the things I missed. And every time I have a relapse, I have missed something and I re-prepare for it. And then I go back into action. Maybe something else comes up that I missed, and I go back into preparation. And over time, so I sort of raise my awareness, and that's why this is actually a spiral model, not a flat model. Um, and eventually, this becomes the process where the relapses become farther and fewer between, and they become less drastic. I don't enable as much. I don't problem solve as much. And I end up going around in preparation action. And when I move into this maintenance and action phase, um, and I'm still doing my work, I tend to have awarenesses about myself. And at the same time, I'm not having those same old relapses. And so I might have to go back into preparation without even relapsing, because I've had this new awareness that, oh, here's something that really sort of bothered me, and I'm starting to be able to react to my emotions. And so relapse eventually does not become part of the process. It becomes worked out and worked through, because I'm basically interrupting myself before the relapse.
I'll interject.
Relapse.
Oh, I'll interject here. I just think it's so powerful to see this because I mean, in with the lens of co-recovery, right? Because when I see this, I'm thinking of, my loved one, right? Like the addict or the alcoholic that's seeing this stages of change, right? But then when you think of it like, oh yeah, I'm enabling. Oh, I relapsed with enabling. Um,
Mhm.
it it's just so similar and powerful to look at it through the lens of like, okay, what am I doing? Like, what can I be doing better? So that's my 2 cents.
Well, and it's true, because the idea is to move. I went back to the previous slide. The idea is to eventually eliminate these relapses, but it's also, what do I define as a relapse? And the word relapse gets associated with addicts and alcoholics. It just means somebody used. Well, it doesn't actually mean that. It means that I did something that I was trying to change that I said I was not going to do, like enabling or over supporting, or one of those codependent traits we talked about last month. So for me, the idea is not to condone relapse, but have the intention that I want this. I want to be able to self-intervene and interrupt those relapses, because I become more aware of how I operate. And so I'm able to stop myself before I actually enable the person. And then the whole time I'm still asking myself these questions. What did I miss? What can I do differently? What can I do better? So I'm continuing to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Here's some of the bad news that people don't like: is typically the action phase could last 1 to 3 years. So these habits, and just think, we're trying to change a habit in a response that's been in process and reinforced for decades, a lot of times. And we're trying to change it in a very short period of time. So don't take this number to heart, but typically, crossing the year mark without having a relapse is usually a pretty big deal. And that means you're heading into this maintenance phase where it lasts approximately 2 to 5 years, right? So there's no real stepping stone. Like I'm pretty sure when I go from preparation to action, like I know tomorrow I'm going to start. There's a marker. When I go from action into maintenance, there's not really a marker because these behaviors are becoming ingrained and more um, regular. The responses are becoming more evolved, and at some point, they're not as in the foreground of my mind as they used to be. They don't need to be because I'm changing that behavior pattern. And at some point, those behaviors become internalized and I can just exit this model. So it's not that a person is going to get stuck going around and around and around. That's not the intention. The intention is to find a lasting change. And so for me, and I'll highlight this a couple of times, this incremental change is important, to take things slowly, not get in a hurry, and be thorough and compassionate when you're doing something like this. Because I really believe, and what I tell my clients that are struggling with substances, you have to have a compassionate look at yourself. And as we looked at some of those traits in the very first one, like from the adult children of alcoholics, one of the traits of a lot of codependents is that they are brutally self-judgmental. And so small changes wins the race, a little bit at a time. Um, so planning, preparation, determination, and I just want to spend a little bit of time here because I really believe this is probably the most important part of this whole change process. I have to do some assessment. I have to do some looking at myself, and I have to put myself in this model that I have a part in this whole addictive cycle, this whole familial relationship. Um, Everything that's gone on may not be my fault, and it most likely isn't anyone's fault, but we all have a part to play that has sort of allowed this process to happen. And sometimes the fault is just that I didn't really know this was being developed in my family. It seemed like the right thing to do. So sometimes the fault is just a lack of awareness. Um, so my purpose here is to sort of help you figure out a way to raise your awareness of what do I need to change. So as I'm going through this, this is almost like a diary entry for me. I would want to write this stuff down, and I would want to write it down over time. So I want to ask myself, what are my emotional reactions to this situation? Am I frustrated? Am I happy? Am I angry? Am I self-deprecating? What are my emotional reactions when things don't go my way, when my addict keeps relapsing, for example, or a person that I'm trying to help is not doing what I want them to do? Um, I personally react a lot in fear. I'm afraid they're not going to be okay. I'm afraid I did something wrong. Um, so really lining up what those emotional reactions are. And then I ask myself, what are my physiological reactions? Well, um, to this day, my heart rate still goes up when my phone rings after 10 o'clock because I think there's something wrong. Most often, there's nothing wrong. Somebody just forgot what time it is and called me. Um, but there's a couple of times where I've gotten calls in the middle of the night that caused that were not good situations. So I have to think about, okay, what are my physiological reactions to this? Is my breathing escalated? Is my heart rate up? Did my temperature go up? Do I feel anxiety? Am I shaky? Because those emotional reactions cause physiological reactions, and those are all cues that something is going well or that something is not going well. Those things tell me how I'm doing. And then I ask myself, what are my behavioral reactions to this situation? What do I do? Do I run to the rescue? Do I stop and think? Everybody has their own way that they react to situations. So typically thoughts, feelings, behaviors, right? So I end up in this behavioral sort of, and this is where people get stuck because the behavior that addicts do or drink or use, and the behavior that codependents typically do is control or manipulate or rescue in some way. So And then I also want to ask myself, how is my past informing my current functioning? And we talked about this last time. Like a lot of times, have people that have developed a codependent sort of trait or traits, it's usually in response to some sort of trauma or bad situation that they've experienced in their life, a bad relationship, an assault or something like that, or a very dysfunctional family. So I need to ask myself, and this is what Susan Johnson was talking about in her book about treating attachment disorder, is that I have to look at my prior relationships and how are they affecting my current functioning. In psychology, they would call that a form of transference or countertransference, because I'm connecting a prior situation that is not really happening to the current situation that it has nothing to do with. And then I ask myself, what meaning do I place on this situation? Um, does this mean I'm a good person? If this person relapse, am I a good person? Or if my manipulation or my control or whatever I tried to do didn't work, what does that mean about me? What construction do I make about this situation? So I'm just sort of, you can tell I'm like moving slowly through this stuff, because I think it takes time to really stir these things up and take a look at ourselves. So, and then I go on, well, I try to pinpoint it a little more. So what am I doing that's not working? I try to identify those specific things. There are some things that we do that have worked for a long time and then they stopped working, right? Um, typically I use the example of parenting, is that for a long time in a person's life with their kiddos, their parenting has been one of teaching and support, and you do pick them up when they fall down. And then at some point, when those kiddos move into young adulthood, adolescence and young adulthood, and emerging adulthood, um, the task actually changes. I need to let them fall down and not pick them up as quickly, but it's hard to do that because it's not easy for me to watch them in pain. So I start to develop these problems, overreacting, over problem solving, over helping, etc. Is what I'm doing something my loved one can or should be able to do on their own? Um, this happens a lot. I use the example of paying rent because it's just a concrete thing that we can talk about. Um, should somebody be able to pay rent on their own? Typically, yes, right? Now, we're talking about somebody who is sick. Actually, we're talking about two people who are sick, one who's giving too much money and one who's taking too much money. And they sort of coincide with each other, and they feed off of each other. So is what, like, basically, is this a problem my loved one can solve on their own? And in doing so, I have to be willing to watch them struggle. Um, how do I determine what success is for me? So this is sort of along with that attachment piece, is that um, if I'm defining my success on whether my loved one is sober or not, there's a problem, because their sobriety is their responsibility and their recovery, and your recovery is your responsibility. My recovery is my responsibility. So how I determine what is successful and what is not successful for me has to be really thought out. And that sort of individuation, that differentiation needs to be thought about, so that my success, my view of myself, is not dependent on what somebody else is doing. Again, what meaning am I placing on this situation? I ask this question a couple of different ways, because I give different answers with different phrasings of the question. You can tell the next one is, what am I telling myself about this situation? Oh, I really screwed that up, or I didn't know what to do. I should have not done that. You're a failure because you didn't do the right thing. And if you would have done something differently, that person may not have drank or used. And so then I ask, what outcome am I attached to? Am I more attached to them being sober than me being healthy, emotionally and physically and spiritually? Right? Am I more attached to somebody else's outcome than my own? Um, I pinpoint it down a little bit further. That one was on there again. Um, Oh, yeah, there were a couple that I inadvertently duplicated on here. What are the consequences for me if I do this behavior? And again, what prior relationship of event, trauma is informing my decisions? Really trying to pinpoint, what am I afraid of? What am I afraid of if I stop enabling or problem solving for this person, right? And then again, what story am I telling myself? And then as I try to pinpoint this down, I have to ask myself a very specific question, um, because we all know that drawing boundaries is mostly difficult because I tend to make boundaries that I can't hold to. And so I need to spend some time determining what is truly doable for me. What is doable regarding my overreacting, my over problem solving, over helping, over loving, over manipulating, over controlling, fill in the blank, right? What is doable for me? And most likely, what's doable is not for me just to say that I'm going to stop those behaviors cold turkey. Just like it's probably not a good idea for an addict to say, oh, I'm going to stop cold turkey, because it very rarely happens that way. So I have to think about how to gradually start building up these boundaries. Um, for example, if I just say that I'm going to stop rescuing someone, and then they actually really get in trouble and they need help, what do I do? Like, they honestly need help, you know? And then I go and take care of it, and now I feel like I've rescued, right? So there are times where, and this is sort of what we talked about last time, where determining what's enabling behavior versus supportive behavior is just as hard as determining when and how much to draw boundaries. So, in my opinion, I think it's much more difficult for um, it's much harder for people on the other side of the coin that are trying to figure out how to support their loved one without enabling them, because it's not always a cut and dry answer. So I have to think about what's doable, and I think about doing the smallest thing possible. Like, I'm just uh, I don't know, I'm not going to rescue this time. I'm really going to watch my feelings and try not to enable, try not to manipulate, try not to over love, over dote, and probably a good thing to start with is just trying not to solve their own problems. So I spend quite a bit of time in this area of planning and preparation so that I can be determined. And I think about this idea of incremental change. I have to do these things in small steps. So, and small movements. So going from planning into action has to be the same thing. So when I decide I'm actually going to act on what I said was doable, I do it one piece at a time. I do it very slowly, very intentionally, and with purpose. I don't just rush in, where a lot of people will have and I'm guilty of this myself. It's like, well, I'm just not going to ever do that again. Or I'm never helping you with money ever again, or I'm never doing that again. And those things just are not doable. So I have to think about what is doable for me and what is the smallest change I can make that is going in the right direction. So this is where I start. I just start taking action by determining what am I willing to do and what I am not willing to. And so you'll see some correlations here. So I'm going to start with the I am willing to. Um, I am willing to experience some discomfort in this process, knowing that I'm going to have to watch my loved ones suffer when I withdraw the support that I usually give them and that they're usually accustomed to. That I am going to feel some discomfort in that. And I use the bicycle analogy, teaching a kiddo how to ride a bicycle. At some point, I have to let go of the sissy bar, which means I will watch them fall and hurt themselves, because everybody always falls. So I have to be prepared to experience some discomfort. And um, of course, I put this paying rent thing. So I actually changed this. I said, stop paying rent. Well, maybe I'll just stop paying as much rent. And so sometimes I advise people, well, I'm going to give you, I don't know, $400 this month, which is your whole rent. I know it's more than that for most people, but I'm going to give you $400 for the next 2 months. But then the month after that, I'm only going to give you 480. So you're going to have to come up with $20 on your own, and the next month 20 less, and the next month 20 less. But I don't want to say that unless I'm willing to hold myself to it. Notice I said not them hold me to it. I need to hold myself to that. So I use that as an example, just as this sort of incremental pulling back of support, so that it doesn't shock the addict or the loved one that much, right? And I've also given them a time frame. Give them 2 months. I got to pay at least $20 this after 2 months. I'll have to pay 40 after that. So it gives them a chance to prepare for their own change, right? Of paying their own rent. Refrain from solving others' problems unless I'm specifically asked and it's not an enabling behavior. I need to let go of my expectations of what the other person, of what I want the other person to do that will determine my well-being. I need to work to let go of my attachments to outcomes, and be okay if they fail. And because I won't have a buy-in with that, but that means that I have to be okay if they succeed, because I won't have a buy-in with that. They'll get full responsibility, right? I only have expectations for my own outcomes. So defining my success less around what others do, focusing less on another person's problems and more on my own. I'm willing to face conflict. So avoidance is one of those behaviors that is very enabling, that people just have a hard time. And a lot of times people are not trained on how to argue or how to have conflict, how to have difficult conversations. I'm willing to be less judgmental. I am willing to trust and respect the other person. I am willing to be authentic. Um, and that's something that might be harder for some people than others. And I'm willing to accept that I have work to do myself, right? And then, of course, I throw in this loving detachment thing. I'm willing to practice loving detachment. I can love this person and also not enable them. Are there any questions or comments?
Feel free to type it in the chat box below.
I'm just that riveting.
I'll chime in and say that all these things that you're willing to do are really hard.
Yeah, that's why incremental change, right?
One thing, yeah.
One small thing that's going the right direction. And also, here's, what I am not willing to do. I am not willing to sacrifice my well-being for another person. And I will not be willing to avoid the problem, even though I might want to, because it'll be uncomfortable to face it. I am not willing to rescue, even though it'll be difficult to determine when a true rescue is needed and when it isn't, right? I'm not willing to make choices that are not in my best interest or that go against my own moral compass. And that goes back to one of the very first slides about I need to know what my emotional responses are. I need to know when I feel frustrated and when I feel sad and when I have that butterfly feeling in my stomach, that's my body telling me that something is not right. And that's my moral compass. And I need to not go against that as much as possible. I'm not willing to do something I am not comfortable with. I am not willing to accept blame. I think that ownership piece is something that we all have to look at, and I need to look at it for myself, and I need to take accountability and ownership for my stuff, and I need to trust that the other person is going to do the same thing. I'm not willing to provide support when it's not necessary to protect another person from their natural consequences. And I have this saying that I tell people that I didn't actually put in a slide, but sometimes I will tell family members that I want you to allow your loved one to enjoy the consequences of their choices, good or bad. You notice I say that very carefully because I need to say it correctly so it's not misinterpreted. And what I mean by enjoy is that I want, if they're having a consequence, they need to enjoy whatever that is, whether it's good or bad. And if it's a bad consequence, it can help them to grow and learn on their own. And that actually is an enjoyable process, even though it doesn't feel comfortable in the moment. But allowing someone to enjoy the consequences of their choices, good or bad, is probably the hardest thing for any family member because it means that they are differentiating and they're allowing their loved ones to learn and grow on their own. Um, I'm not willing to continue in an enmeshed relationship, and this is kind of what a lot of families get into, especially with an addictive cycle, is that it's like this vicious cycle that they can't get out of. And I always describe this as kind of two pieces of Velcro stuck together. And those shoes that you have that have the Velcro strips is pretty easy. But if you have two like big pieces of Velcro, they'll actually hold a person's body weight, and they're very difficult. And I have to think about unsnapping them one hook at a time to get that enmeshment to release, so that I can differentiate and individuate from this other person. I'm not willing to allow this situation to consume my own life, like it has in the past and like it usually does. Um, and if I've set the right boundaries in the right increments, I will be not willing to allow my boundaries to be broken. And that's why it's so important to go back to that preparation and look at, what am I willing to do? What will be doable for me? What's small enough that I know I can accomplish it, so that I can set attainable goals for myself to hold these boundaries. And then I can actually say, I'm not willing to allow these boundaries to be broken. And if it does happen, there's no problem with it, because that's basically a relapse. I go back to preparation. I figure out what I did wrong and what led me up to breaking that boundary, and I start over again. Right? So to me, there's never a mistake in any of this. It's only learning and growth. Um,
We had someone type in, so important to have coaching or sponsorship to practice.
yeah, thanks for saying that. And that's part of the reason I don't like webinars, and I do like groups where I can see everybody, because I can actually role play with someone and demonstrate some of this stuff. And it's kind of interesting that you say that, because in some of the groups I do with family members, so sometimes I'll get the family members and the um, uh, addicts and alcoholics together in the same room, and I will actually role play with one of the addicts, and I'll tell them to be as defiant as they want to be. And what happens is I actually end up having those feelings, and I'm the one demonstrating the task, or the what I'm trying to demonstrate, what I'm describing. And I actually, though it's a role play, I still feel those, my heart rate goes up, I get flustered in my head. And so what Jody is saying there, it's so important to have somebody that you can practice with, which is part of that incremental change. So before I actually go into this slide that I'm in right now, with my loved one, I will do it with someone else that's safe, like a sponsor or a therapist or a close friend. I'll practice these conversations, and I'll have them. It's just kind of like doing a mock interview. People don't like doing that, but they feel so much better when they go into an actual interview, because they've had some practice and they've worked out some of the kinks. And so what Jody is saying is exactly right. That practice is so important. Um, Thanks, Martin. Please get a see the cut. Yeah.
Any books that you would
Uh,
recommend for clinicians or codependent
yeah.
individuals?
That book list in that first section at the beginning. And I don't know, Martin, if you were on the first one, but there were actually some other books in there. But the Codependent No More, the Susan Johnson book is more of a therapy primer, but it's actually really good. There's another book that I didn't mention before that's just called Attached. Um, Amir Levine. I have to hold in front of my face, but here's a
Oh,
Whoops.
your
There
background.
we go. Yeah, so if you just type attached, that's actually a pretty good book. I brought it with me to Devil's Tower, so um, I have my books with me all the time, no matter where I'm camping. Sorry, that's a joke.
I can also send out the YouTube from the first session as well. I can send links to the first and second, third
Yeah,
session as well.
yeah, yeah. Y'all can have access to those, or you can just email me separately, and I can send you some other things. But really, those codependent no more, the new codependency, adult children of alcoholics, the codependency book, which is sorry, I'm going to show you this one. So this Codependence Anonymous is a great book. Um, and any of the Al-Anon books are awesome. There's one that I just got that is quite popular called The Language of Letting Go by Melody Beatty. But there's tons of stuff, but the Codependence Anonymous, this Language of Letting Go is great. The Facing Codependence by P.M. Melody. All of those are awesome resources. So, and yeah, anybody who's here that weren't at the first two, feel free to ask Megan for copies of those PowerPoints. Um, and so anyway, this last step, which is kind of like leading into the next one, which will be a little bit more about communication and how to navigate somebody that's really challenging your boundaries. Um, some of these first two things, so in this action stage, so people have all heard of I feel statements, and usually they'll say, when you blank, I feel blank. I like to switch them around um, because if I say to someone, when you drank, if someone was saying that to me, I'm already thinking about, oh crap, I screwed up and I drank, and I'm not even hearing the I feel part. So I flip it around so that they can hear how you feel first, because my intention with communication is a sense of understanding. And also for a codependent, I'm talking about myself first before the other person. So in a way, there's this symbolic sort of switch that happens. I feel very upset when you call me drunk, for example. Um, and then, of course, some of the Pia Melody stuff, and I stole a lot of this from her, that, about whatever the situation is, I feel frustrated, or I feel frustrated about whatever situation. Am I missing? Yeah, I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing other questions. Of course, this third statement comes straight from Love First by John and Deborah J. I love you, and instead of I love you, but I love you, and you drank last night. I love you, and you're still drinking. I love you, and you're not working your program. It's really interesting when this phrase is turned around for the codependent person, when the addict who's in recovery for a long time and there's a resistant codependent, and the addict says, I love you, and you're not working your program. It's kind of turns the tables. But this is a way for me to separate the behavior from the person. I can love this person and not be involved. My belief about this situation is this. The story I'm telling myself about this situation is, and I just like to be very transparent. Hey, look, what I'm attached to is your recovery. I'm too attached to your recovery, right? And I put too much weight on that. I need to be attached to my recovery. And when somebody is asking for something that you don't want to do, or your feelings are telling you that this feels uncomfortable, what I ask people is, well, and I may not say I'm curious because that might be a little trite, but I might say, well, what if, they might say, I need help with rent. And instead of just giving them rent, and again, I'm just using rent because it's an easy, concrete thing. I will say, well, what have you tried so far? And if you've never asked that question, they might be taken aback by it. What do you mean, what have I tried? I've tried asking you. And then I could say, well, what else have you tried? So before you come and ask me for help, I'd like to know what you've tried to solve this problem on your own. So I'm letting them know, and I'm sending them the message that I expect them to use their brain and to do some of their own behaviors to solve this problem, because I'm working on not doing that for them. And then at the end, you know, I mean, the last thing I have is just help me understand what's going on. If they say I haven't tried anything, help me understand why you haven't tried anything. Well, I've always called you. Yeah, I'm working on that changing. I I know you've always called me, and I really need to stop. Uh, I need to stop solving your problems for you so fast. So I'm working on that. So I need you to do some work on finding another way. So um, questions or comments? I have my favorite Melody Beatty quote in here. Detaching doesn't mean you don't care. It just means that it means we're learning to love, care, and be involved without going crazy. So I'll leave this up. And is there anybody, are there still people on, or do we have questions?
Yep, we have people on still. No questions that I see right now. Just had a few people asking for the slides from last time.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, you know, I'm sort of right now this is the first iteration of all of these, and so you know, again, they're just my experience and collections of. You're welcome, Martin. Thank you. Thanks, Kathleen. It's my collection of things and experiences, and so I'll probably likely do these again live. So it won't be the first time, and the next time I do it, it'll be a little bit different. It probably will evolve a little bit, but yeah, and yeah, this is all public. Um, it's all my made up stuff, and or collected stuff. I shouldn't say made up, because it's all collections, and things that need to be cited should be cited on there. So um,
I don't think your PhD's, made up stuff.
well, you know, it's hard because I want to be cognizant, because I didn't make up all of this. This is all sort of what I've gathered over the years, and it's sort of, I always tell people it's like a tapestry of recovery um, uh, sort of strategies, I guess. And so, like the stages of change, of course, that's Prochaska and Clemente, but I've sort of, um, you know, through experience of working with people, I've found ways that it's more helpful to convey to people, so it becomes more accessible. So I try to make this stuff accessible, really, to everyone. So,
Awesome. Lots of people saying thank you. And I'll send out the recording and the presentations, also the previous recordings, by the end of the day tomorrow. So thank you so much for everyone who joined.
great, y'all. And if you feel like you want to send me something personally, Megan has my email, and you can get that from her. And thank you so much. Appreciate you all for being here.